Welcome to Echoes of Fear. Imagine walking through a peaceful neighborhood, searching for bargains, only to stumble upon something much darker than you could have ever imagined. What if that vintage mirror you just bought wasn't just old, but cursed? Or that innocent-looking doll you took home was hiding a malevolent spirit? In today's video, we'll explore 5 disturbing yard sale horror stories that will make you think twice before picking up that one item you think is just a great deal. These aren't just stories, they are real encounters with the supernatural, objects that should never have been sold, and bargains that come with a chilling price. So, are you brave enough to hear these tales? Stick around and don't forget to hit the like button if you dare. Welcome to Echoes of Fear. Let's begin. In 2010, Jenna and her husband, Mark, had just moved into their first apartment in the vibrant French Quarter of New Orleans. They were eager to decorate their new place and decided to spend their Saturday morning browsing a yard sale in the heart of the historic neighborhood. As they walked down Royal Street, they stumbled upon an old townhouse with a cluttered yard, filled with a hodgepodge of antiques, furniture, and various odds and ends. The sale was hosted by an elderly woman named Mrs. Fontaine, who smiled at them from a creaky rocking chair on the porch. Among the sea of items, Jenna's gaze landed on a large, ornate mirror propped up against the wall. The frame was a striking gold, with intricate carvings of angels, roses, and vines twisting together in a delicate but almost haunting pattern. The glass itself was old and cloudy, reflecting the world around it with an eerie stillness. There was something about the mirror that drew Jenna in, as if it had a magnetic pull. Mrs. Fontaine, noticing Jenna's fascination, leaned forward and spoke in a low, almost sorrowful voice. "That mirror belonged to my great-grandmother. She always said it had a special power, a connection to the past. Some say it traps spirits inside. Others say it shows you things you aren't meant to see. I never let anyone buy it, but, well, it's time for it to go." Despite the unsettling warning, Jenna felt a strange attachment to the mirror and purchased it, feeling almost as though she was meant to take it home. That evening, as they set the mirror in their living room, it played tricks on them. At first, it was just subtle. Flickers of movement in the reflection, shadows that didn't match the room, but then it became more pronounced. The reflection of the room would change without anyone moving. Jenna would glance into the mirror, only to find objects shifted, or even a faint ghostly figure standing behind her. Though when she turned around, no one was there. One night, as she sat alone on the couch, she saw a shadowy figure standing in the reflection, its face obscured, but its eyes gleaming through the darkness. It was as though the figure was reaching out, trying to get closer. Panicked, Jenna tried to get rid of the mirror by placing it outside, but the next morning it was back in their living room, untouched. Desperate, she attempted to burn it, but the flames wouldn't touch the frame. Eventually, Jenna and Mark returned to the French Quarter to return the mirror to Mrs. Fontaine, only to find her house abandoned, the once welcoming porch now overgrown with ivy. No one remembered Mrs. Fontaine or her family. The house was empty, and the yard sale had disappeared without a trace. The only thing left was the mirror, still reflecting them from an unknown place, its unsettling glow lingering. Before we continue, I'd like to thank everyone who has been listening to the stories and following along. I really enjoy this content and want to keep bringing it to you. Please like and share. Now let's move on to the second story. In 2015, Jake Thompson and his girlfriend Rachel had recently moved to Asheville, North Carolina, and were spending their Saturday exploring the quaint neighborhoods. They decided to check out a local yard sale at a house on Riverside Drive, a peaceful street lined with towering oak trees and charming cottages. The sale was being hosted by an elderly woman named Margot, who had a warm, kind smile, but there was something a little off about the way she spoke, a hint of sorrow in her voice. As Jake and Rachel sifted through piles of old books, vintage furniture, and trinkets, Rachel's eyes landed on an old porcelain doll sitting on a shelf. It had delicate features, pale blue eyes, a perfectly sewn dress, and a soft porcelain face that seemed almost lifelike. However, there was something unsettling about the doll's smile. It seemed too wide, too knowing, as if it were hiding a dark secret. Margot noticed Rachel staring at the doll and walked over to her, her expression suddenly becoming serious. "That doll belonged to my daughter," she said, her voice quivering. "She was a sweet girl, but after she passed away, I couldn't bring myself to part with it. People say the doll holds her spirit, and it moves on its own sometimes. It's not something I'd let just anyone take home." Rachel, captivated by the story and the doll itself, felt an inexplicable connection and insisted on buying it. That night, she placed the doll on the shelf in their living room. At first, it seemed harmless, but as the days went by, Jake began noticing strange occurrences. The doll would be in different positions. Its head turned, its arms moved. It seemed as though the doll was watching them. One night, Jake woke up to hear soft giggles coming from the living room, followed by the feeling of something cold and lifeless pressing against his cheek. When he opened his eyes, the doll was sitting on his pillow, its eyes wide open, staring at him with that same mocking smile. Terrified, Jake tried to get rid of the doll, wrapping it in a blanket and placing it outside in the trash. But each time he woke up, it would be back on the shelf, its eyes following him wherever he went. One evening, he opened the door to toss it out once and for all, only to freeze in his tracks. There, sitting on the front porch, was the doll, its head tilted, its smile even wider, as if it were waiting for them. Frantic, they returned to Margot's house, only to find it abandoned, the lawn overgrown, and no trace of the elderly woman. The yard sale was gone, and the doll was nowhere to be found. But every so often, Rachel would catch a glimpse of the doll's smile in her reflection, lingering just out of sight. Scary, right? Well, let's move on to the third one. In 2018, Claire and her husband Mark decided to spend a weekend in Charleston, South Carolina, exploring its cobblestone streets and beautiful historic district. They stumbled upon a yard sale hosted by an elderly widow named Mrs. Whitmore on Church Street, a picturesque tree-lined road famous for its old-fashioned charm. Mrs. Whitmore's home was a large Victorian-style house with ivy crawling up the sides, and the front yard was filled with antiques, old furniture, and jewelry. As Claire sifted through a box of vintage rings, one caught her eye, a beautiful antique wedding ring with an intricate design of twisted vines and delicate flowers. The ring sparkled in the sunlight, and Claire was immediately drawn to it. Mrs. Whitmore noticed her interest and approached her, her eyes growing heavy with emotion. "That ring belonged to my daughter," she said softly. "She was engaged to be married, but she disappeared before the wedding could happen. After that, I couldn't bear to part with it. But some say it brings bad luck, that it calls out to those who shouldn't wear it." Despite the warning, Claire felt an undeniable pull to the ring and purchased it. That night, as she placed it on her finger, she began to experience unsettling things. Strange whispers filled the air, faint but clear enough to make her uneasy. At night, she would wake up with the feeling that someone was watching her, and sometimes she would hear footsteps echoing through the empty hallways of their apartment. The whispers grew louder and more insistent, calling her name in an unfamiliar voice. Claire began to see the reflection of a woman standing behind her in the mirror, her face obscured, but her eyes burning with intensity. One night, Claire woke up to find herself standing in front of the door, clutching the ring tightly, her body shaking with fear. Desperate, she and Mark returned to Mrs. Whitmore's house, hoping to return the ring and rid themselves of the curse. But when they arrived, the house was abandoned, the yard sale gone without a trace. The ring, however, was nowhere to be found, and Claire's nightmares persisted. We're heading towards the final stories. Once again, thank you for the support. In 2012, Michael Roberts and his friend Sarah were spending the weekend in Phoenix, Arizona, when they decided to check out a yard sale being held at a home on McKinley Street. The sale was hosted by an elderly man named Frank, whose weathered face seemed to carry years of sorrow and grief. As they sifted through boxes of old photos, Sarah stumbled upon an old faded photograph of a young woman standing in front of a large rundown house. The woman had long dark hair and wore a vintage dress, but what struck Michael the most were her eyes. They seemed too intense, as if they were staring directly into his soul. Frank noticed Sarah holding the photo and hesitated before speaking. "That's my daughter, Lily," he said, his voice trembling. "She disappeared years ago, and after that, I couldn't bear to throw away her photo. But it feels wrong, as if she's still here, watching us. Some say it's haunted." Intrigued, Michael bought the photo, thinking it was just a relic of a bygone time. That night, as he placed it on his desk, he began to feel strange. The woman's eyes in the photograph seemed to follow him wherever he went. Over the next few days, the whispers started. At first, they were soft, almost inaudible, but soon they grew louder. Late at night, Michael would hear his name being called from just behind him, but when he turned around, no one would be there. One night, Michael woke up to find the photo had moved from his desk to his nightstand, the woman's eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Desperate, he tried to burn the photo, but the flames wouldn't touch it. The next day, he returned to Frank's house only to find it abandoned, the yard sale gone, and the photo missing. Michael's nights were never the same again, and the whispers never stopped. And lastly, the fifth story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support the community. In 2011, Ryan and his roommate Alex were spending a lazy Saturday afternoon in Brooklyn, New York. They decided to visit a local yard sale at a townhouse on Bedford Avenue. The sale was being run by an older couple, Mr. and Mrs. Granger, who seemed friendly enough but spoke in cryptic, odd terms. As they dug through a pile of records, Alex found a vinyl album with an album cover that stood out. A dark, almost surreal image of a figure with glowing eyes, surrounded by eerie symbols. The title read, "Songs of the Forgotten." Alex, being an avid vinyl collector, couldn't resist purchasing it. The Grangers warned them not to play it, but they shrugged it off as eccentric old people superstitions. That evening, they played the record, and at first it sounded like any other album, old, crackling, and full of vintage sounds. But as the song progressed, it became increasingly distorted, with a strange low chanting that echoed in the background. The chanting grew louder, more menacing, until it was impossible to ignore. Ryan tried to turn off the record player, but the needle wouldn't lift, as though something was holding it down. The song took on a sinister quality, the voices seemingly chanting their names. Terrified, Ryan yanked the record off the turntable, only to discover it had begun to crack and warp in his hands. Desperate, they threw the album out, but every time they went to sleep, they would hear the chanting, growing louder and louder until they couldn't escape. The next day, they returned to the Grangers' house to confront them, but when they arrived, the house was abandoned and no one knew the couple. The cursed vinyl was gone, but the echoes of the chanting still haunted Ryan and Alex, a reminder of the price of curiosity. And with that, we come to the end of these chilling yard sale horror stories. Did you get the chills? I am still thinking about how those innocent objects can hide so much evil. Remember, not every bargain is worth it, and sometimes what seems harmless could have a much darker story behind it. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit that like button and share it with your friends. And of course, if you haven't subscribed yet, do so now. That way, you'll never miss out on all the eerie tales we share here on Echoes of Fear. If you have a creepy story of your own, drop it in the comments. Who knows? It might just become the focus of our next video. Until next time, and remember, fear is always closer than you think.